Good evening, friends, and welcome to our panel discussion on Black musicians and liberation. My name is Jackson Meredith. I promise to be brief with these opening announcements. I realize that no one logs into a Black History Month celebration to hear a white man ramble on. This discussion is being recorded tonight and it will be uploaded later, probably to YouTube. We will be sharing that link once it's ready so you can watch this again or share it with your friends. This event is proudly hosted by the Black Cat House. We have been active in Lincoln, Nebraska since June of 2013. We organize educational events about oppressive power structures and how to dismantle them. To contact us or hear about future events, you can follow us on Facebook or visit theblackcathouse.org. On behalf of the whole Black Cat Collective, I would really like to thank all of our distinguished guests speaking tonight. One thing that a small grassroots group like ours is not particularly good at is raising lots of money. It would not have been realistic for us to offer market rate honorariums to our speakers. We are so fortunate to have public intellectuals who will volunteer their time and expertise. I will now introduce tonight's moderator. Lory Janelle Dance is an associate professor of sociology and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. From 2009 to 2017, Dr. Dance was a visiting senior researcher at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University in Sweden. Currently, she is a visiting senior researcher at Lund's Human Rights Studies program. Her most recent article is titled Ideal Dialogues with Immigrants of Color in Sweden and the United States. Her current book in progress is called Gone with the Neoliberal Wind: Minority Teens, School Reform, and Urban Change in Sweden and the U.S. Dr. Dance has established cross-national symposia using poetry to engage urban youths in empowering dialogues. Good evening, Dr. Dance.
Good evening. So I guess you're going to go ahead and upload the bio information. And as as Jackson just said, am the moderator for this event. Before I introduce our speakers, let me say a little bit about the Institute for Ethnic Studies. The Institute for Ethnic Studies includes 22 joint appointed faculty members from 6 academic departments within the College of Arts and Sciences and 30 affiliated faculty members from departments across the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. The Institute is composed of 3 interdisciplinary programs: African and African American Studies, Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies, and Native American Studies. The Institute for Ethnic Studies and African American Studies is happy to partner with the Black Cat House to bring you Black Musicians in Liberation, a panel discussion. We have 3 speakers tonight, and they will speak in the order that I am presenting them. They are Dawne Y. Curry, Anders Neergaard, and Marvin Lynn. And again, my name is Lory Dance, and I am the moderator for this event. Dawne Y. Curry is an associate professor of history and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Dr. Curry's research field is 20th and 21st century African history, with emphasis on South African protest and resistance struggles. She also explores oral history, women and gender studies, comparative Black history, and African colonial history. Dr. Curry's recent publications have included an examination of the northeastern Johannesburg township of Alexandra and its contribution to South Africa's liberation struggle from 1970 to 1979. During the 2017-2018 academic year, Dr. Curry was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar in South Africa. Her current book project addresses how African women were intellectuals during the pre-apartheid era of 1910 to 1948. Dr. Curry's featured rap will be Show 'Em What You Got by U.S. hip-hop super artist, the group Public Enemy. After Dr. Curry speaks, the next speaker you will hear is Anders Neergaard. Anders Neergaard is a professor in sociology, ethnic and migration studies in the Department of Migration, Ethnicity, and Society at Linköping University in Sweden. His research focuses on power and resistance, especially discrimination, racialization, and racism. Dr. Neergaard's co-written articles include, and there are several, Race and the Upsurge of Antagonistic Popular Movements in Sweden, Theorizing Racism, the Swedish Racial Regime, A Contradiction in Terms, Migrant Activists in the Swedish Democrat Party, Crisis of Solidarity, Changing Welfare and Migration Regimes in Sweden, Why Are Care Workers from the Global South Disadvantaged, and Cultures of Rejection in the COVID-19 Crisis. Dr. Neergaard's featured rap is Svarta Duvor och Vissna Liljor. In English, that translates to Black Pigeons and Withered Lilies, by Sweden's hip-hop artist Kartellen, featuring Sweden's Afro-Swedish hip-hop genius, Timbuktu. And Dr. Neergaard is going to focus on Timbuktu's verse. Last but certainly not least, the third voice you will hear, the third presenter, is Marvin Lynn. Marvin Lynn is Dean and Professor in the College of Education at Portland State University in Oregon. He is a member of the Board of Directors for the Carnegie Project for the Education Doctorate and the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. Dr. Lynn founded the Critical Race Studies and Education Association and the South Shore Opera Company of Chicago. He is a trained operatic baritone and is internationally recognized as a scholar of race and education. Dr. Lynn co-edited, along with Dr. Adrian Dixon, the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. Dr. Lynn's featured song is What's Going On by rhythm and blues superstar, the late, great Marvin Gaye. So those are our three speakers. After they speak, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. We're going to start with Show 'Em What You Got by U.S. hip-hop super artist group Public Enemy.
Wow, I could just stand there and sit there and dance the night away. The reason why this song resonated with me is from the first phrase that says, "Freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitude." This was a quote of Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman who escaped slavery in Maryland. And he uttered these words that, when placed within the list of ancestors, the songs had me questioning, what exactly is freedom? Have we attained it? Will we ever attain it? Even when the revolution was not televised, and when it is televised, when will we get freedom? But as Public Enemy says, the same God that gave wisdom to Stephen Biko, the same God that gave wisdom to Rosa Parks, gave strength to Martin Luther King, to Malcolm X, the same God that gave wisdom to Nelson Mandela, the same God that gave wisdom to Winnie Mandela, that's where we're going to find our answers. And so I looked at some quotes, thinking about what have those before us told us about how to attain freedom. Marcus Garvey said, the great Jamaican who was a cultural nationalist, a Pan-Africanist, who founded the United Negro Improvement Association in 1921. He said this: "We must give up the silly idea of folding our hands and waiting on God to do everything for us. If God had intended for that, then he would not have given us a mind. Whatever you want in life, you must make up your mind to do it for yourself." And in another quote that also talks about the liberation of the mind, he says, We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. Mind is your only ruler, sovereign. The man, woman who is not able to develop and use his mind is bound to be the slave of the other man who uses his mind. So we must also invoke here, free your mind, the rest will follow. Martin Luther King Jr., the great orator and also leader of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, says, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the sea like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth like brothers." And he also said that an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. So now we got someone talking about the mind. We got someone talking about brotherhood and sisterhood and the common collective, the spirit of the Southern African salvation, Ubuntu, I am because you are, or as the National Association of Colored Women's motto says, lifting as we climb. We cannot go further without lifting up the next person. Winnie Mandela also tells us how we can attain freedom. She says, there is no longer anything I can fear. There is nothing the government has not done to me. There isn't any pain I have not known. So what she's saying is we must free ourselves by not being afraid of what is going to be thrown at us. So, and lastly, she also says, it is only when all Black groups join hands and speak with one voice that we shall be a bargaining force, which will decide its own destiny. And this is similarly related to what Garvey and to what King is saying. They were rather in different geographical places, but their messages and their voices intersected. We should continue to talk about this song because, as Marcus Garvey further says, that a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is a tree without roots. And Public Enemy highlights those trees, rather the roots from which the trees we sprung. Marcus Garvey, Adam Clayton Powell, Rosa Parks, Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela. And this message today is still current because, as Billie Holiday once sang with Strange Fruit, she says, Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Now, this was a mournful, eerie song that does not call out explicitly lynching, but the metaphor is there. And it's a metaphor for present day, for the types of lynchings that we are undergoing through the police and other horrors and trauma of anti-Black racism. And Marvin Gaye, that well-known singer who once sang, what's going on? Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. You know we got to find a way to bring some love in here today. We do. There are too many that have fallen. And I'm going to conclude with NWA, that popular group that hailed out of the West Coast with Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Eazy-E. And the reason why we need to listen to Public Enemy's Show 'Em What You Got and why the song is still current is because of this. A young nigga got it bad because I'm brown and not the other color. So police think they have the authority to kill a minority. And they have shown us again and again. Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, say their name, and I can go on and on and on. Y'all, freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Curry. If y'all got some questions, write them down because we're going to come back at the end after all speakers have spoken. So thank you, Dr. Carey. I'm riled up. Next, you're going to see I want you to try and listen, even though you may not understand Swedish. I want you to listen to the passion in the song. Listen to the tone and the flow of the song as you hear Svarta, Duvor, och Vissna, Liljor, which is black pigeons and withered lilies. And then after that, you will hear from Dr. Anders Neergaard, who will translate the song. He won't let you have to try to figure it all out by yourselves. Okay? Second song, please.
I couldn't hear it myself, but I've heard it a lot of times before. This song, I was thinking about different songs when I was invited to this. Thank you for the invitation. I participated in the Happy Birthday manifestation in Washington, D.C. in January 15th, 81, when Stevie Wonder launched Happy Birthday. And I was also thinking about Tracy Chapman and talking about the revolution. But then I picked this because it's about Sweden and the situation of racialized people in Sweden. And I'll read the lyrics from the last 2 minutes of the song. And the first, it starts like this. The old are free and the young have no future. Yes, they will take you and send you home, even though you have lived here all your life. Black pigeons appear and lilies are no more. But the dream in us lives on, even though the country is buried. Black pigeons appear, all the plants wither. Old sick toil, Reinfeldt, that was the Swedish prime minister, is to extinguish the spark. Work to 75. How many will be able to work to 75? They a Cruella de Vil, and we them fucking 101. Where my black dots and their eyes flutter. Got a headache? Swear. So much shit they talk. They paint white on black pigeons. While the family is divided by Swedish marked bullets. Fucking yes, I'm controversial, man. White as hell, therefore trembles all fucking power. No role model for children, but your children have been robbed of everything on my side of town. Why? Come on, it's my country, it's your country. Fuck the SD, the Sweden Democrats, the racist party in the Swedish parliament, until they are sent out of the parliament. Swedish politics is just about nothing. Oh, the best thing about Sweden is Zlatan, the soccer player. The old are free and the young the old are not free and the young have no future. Yes, they will take you and send you home, even though you have lived here all your life. Black pigeons appear and lilies are no more. But the dream in us lives on, even though the country is buried. They want to build a country on hatred, on ignorance and fear. No thanks, I'm fine. We need love for every human being. So in 2014, we will see what our country is done on. And I hope I see the racists disappear and that the fascists disappear, for the heart sits here on the left. So think about which side you want to lead this country. That was the lyrics of the latter part of the song, and it speaks to me in a number of ways. As a US citizen, through my mother, I voted in the last election, and I mean, what he was talking about was a little bit a situation that resembled, but not exactly, the situation in United States during the fall last year. Another thing that I really like about this is that, as a sociologist, sorry for being boring, I've been studying racism through what I call exclusionary racism and exploitative racism. And the point, what they do in this song is, in a sense, showing both aspects of racism, how it hits racialized people in Sweden. On the one hand, it's very linked to the exclusionary racism of the Sweden Democrats, and especially focusing on racialization of migrants, especially Muslim others and blacks from Africa coming to Sweden. So that's one aspect of it, but it's also focusing on the neoliberal politics of the government in 2013 that really hits racialized workers through unemployment, through the worst employment situations, overqualifications in the labor market, and so on. So it's a play also with the Swedish national anthem, the first line, which the anthem starts, the old are free, but here it's not free, and so on. So what they are doing in this song is in a number of ways relating to the very experience of being a racialized inhabitant of Sweden. At that time, 2013, just before our election in 2014. But it's a situation that has continued in many ways. For me, I'm a boring sociologist, one of those square and so on. But so music for me is often linked to listening to progressive messages. I listen to music when I'm sad, angry, hopeful, in love, but it's always progressive music I'm listening to. So when I hear this song, I hear both an analysis that I think is a quite accurate analysis of the situation in Sweden. For most people looking at Sweden, they often have the idea that everything is fantastic and equal in Sweden. But the last 30 years in Sweden has implied some dramatic changes in increasing inequalities, in increasing racism, in the organization, also mobilization of racist parties, and also the merging of what I call this exclusionary racism and exploitative racism. So this song hit me directly as an attempt to connect music to a progressive political project, to get people to mobilize, to get people to vote, to get people to participate in changing politics. In Sweden, most of the discussion on racism has especially focused on exclusionary racism, that is, racism linked especially to migration and the racialization of migrants. This song also brings together, and I think this is it's a strong message in this song, that racism counts both in the exclusionary form, but directed against migrants, but also in the exploitative form. And this is also, I see, in a sense, a way of working with the idea of social movements and of social change, because the Afro-Swedes in Sweden is a quite small group. We know from a number of studies they are experiencing, but also together with the Roma population and the Muslim, they are experiencing the blunt of racism in different forms. But it's not until recently we've seen beginning of organization and mobilization of Afro-Swedes, both as Afro-Swedes, but also in a broader alliance of those being racialized as non-Swedes in the Swedish society, and further on in a broader coalition with those fighting for social justice more broadly defined. So for me, this song is a song of hope in a time of quite hostile environment, being Black, being poor, and a hostile environment that is both visible in the concrete politics, but increasingly also so in mainstream media, seeing migrants, seeing those racialized, seeing Afro-Swedes as a problem, as a threat, and as something really to get rid of. There's also a reference to fascism in the song, and I think this is something to take seriously, because when we see this closer merging of what I call exclusionary racism and exploitative racism, we are on the move towards fascist politics. And I know in the United States we can discuss a lot of the problems with it, but it was, I voted for Biden, of course. It wasn't my first pick in ideas of the perfect politician, but it was so substantially better than voting for Trump. So and in Sweden we are in a situation quite similar, that there's a merging of different right-wing and often racist forces, political forces, and so on. And now the question is, will there be a possibility of building some kind of counter-social movement, some kind of political project that both targets the neoliberal exploitative racism, but also the more classic exclusionary racism of the Sweden Democrats? I think I'll stop here, but I want to emphasize that although the times are tough, they end the song and in a hopeful manner. And it's also nice to recall that after this song was sung in 2013, in the elections of 2014, there was a shift in government, but that was reversed again in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you. I have questions for you. And those others who have questions for Dr. Neergaard, please write them down so you don't forget. So now you may have written a question for Dr. Curry and a question for Dr. Neergaard. But now we're going to hear from Dr. Marvin Lynn.
Well, first of all, Dr. Dance, I want to thank you for having me. Those of you may not know, but Dr. Dance and I go way back. I was a fresh young scholar coming out of UCLA and on a big campus at the University of Maryland. And Dr. Dance was one of the first friendly faces I saw. And so we've been connected ever since. So I'm grateful to you, sister, for your partnership and for your friendship.
I was a less fresh and less young scholar, but I was still kind of fresh and young at the time myself.
That's right. Yeah, we were both assistant professors, right? And Jackson, thank you too for all the work that you've done to make this happen. So I'm just honored to be here. You know, as Dr. Dance shared, I'm a lot of things. I'm a scholar, I'm a teacher, and I'm also an administrator. And I'm a musician, the singing kind. I refer to singers as musicians. A lot of people don't, but I do, because you have to be a musician in order to do that work. So when I was asked about what song, I would choose and what impacted me, I thought about what's going on. And you've already heard a little bit of it previously, but it's been so important to me in my life. In fact, I was born a couple of months after this song was released and was being played on the radio. And as a result of that, my name is Marvin. And so my mother, as I was growing up, always reminded me of why that was my name and why this song was so important to her. So I'll start by reading the lyrics, and then I'll talk a little bit about why the song is important to me and what I think the relevance is for today in response to the questions that were shared. So, mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. You know, we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Yeah. Father, Father, we don't need to escalate. You see, war is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate. You know, we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Picket lines and picket signs, don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. He says that many times. And then the next part of it is, mother, mother, everybody thinks we're wrong. Oh, but who are they to judge us simply because our hair is long? Oh, you know, we've got to find a way to bring some understanding here today. And he goes back to talk about picket lines and picket signs. And he says, come talk to me so you can see what's going on. And if you listen to the song, there's a lot of chatter and conversation in the song that was so typical of the African-American experience in terms of the socializing aspect of that and the conversations that are going on that was shaping and influencing what was happening at the time. Why does this song resonate with me? I talked about my family situation. Well, my family is from the Delta region of the United States, and that's kind of northern Mississippi, just south of Memphis, Tennessee. And I don't know if you all know this, but that place is the birth of the blues. The blues was born when my mother was born, my grandmother, my father was born. They were all born in that little place called the Delta, where the blues was born. So I had no choice but to be surrounded by music as a young person growing up on the south side of Chicago. And so listening to Bobby Blue Bland and B.B. King and Muddy Waters and a whole range of folks, right? But I also grew up in the church and was singing and listening to holy music and church music. And like Marvin Gaye talks about growing up in the church too. His daddy was a pastor. And, you know, there was a strict rule that you weren't supposed to sing that unholy music. And I remember that same experience. So as a singer, I was to sing gospel, not the unholy stuff. Yet I was surrounded by the unholy stuff all the time. My grandmother was a church lady by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, but had a past, right, as a woman who liked to party and had all these blues tapes and so on around the house that when she decided she was going to stop listening to them, my aunts and uncles continued listening to that. So I continue that familiarity with that music. My mother was not a church goer. So Sunday afternoons after I got home from church, I was surrounded by, guess what? Motown music. Most of that music from the 60s, Marvin Gaye, The Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Four Tops, right? But I also heard the song What's Going On many a Sunday, and I was told over and over again, you know, why that song was so significant. As I grew up, I listened to my mother's stories about life and about what it meant to grow up in the Delta and the racism that she experienced, the way in which she'd had to cross the street when white folk walked down the street, and how little they were paid, how their labor was exploited, right? This was in the 40s and 50s in the Delta region, and how she escaped at the age of 19 because she got tired of being treated like she was not human. And so I grew up listening to those stories, and I had an aching for social justice. And as an educator, I started teaching elementary school in the early 90s, and I was trying to teach in the tradition of Paulo Freire, right? Who has taught us to read the word so that we can read the world. And by reading the world, we then become able to change the world. And so in one sense, the phrase "what's going on" is a reading of the world. And I operated as a teacher with that in mind. You know, as I said, I'm a singer, and before now, I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about the intersection of music and race. I talk about race and I talk about music in different sort of ways. But as a singer, I'm also drawn to music that speaks to social injustice and liberation. And so that song really brings about a range of critical questions that I think we need to continue to ask in our society. So as a critical race theorist, I ask, what's going on? Why is racism so persistent? It helps us understand the way in which racism is rooted in the very structure of our society, how it explains the intersections really between racism, sexism, homophobia, and elitism, how these interlocking systems come together to create a set of circumstances that limit both the possibility and the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But if you don't ask the question, what's going on, you'll never get to that answer, right? And so critical race theorists are always asking that question, what's going on? We're asking now, what's going on with anti-Black racism, and why are we targeted? Why are we looking back? And we're looking back to slavery and its insistence that Black folks be marked by the color of their skin as inferior. And then we're led to see this and how it led to the development of a whole set of policies and practices that are designed to uphold and support this inherently racist system we call America. Critical race theorists of education ask the question, what's going on in schools? And we examine the way in which exclusionary racist curriculum combined with racist teaching practices and educators who lack the understanding of their students' humanity and how they work together to create a set of conditions that produce more and more Black misery. So asking the question, what's going on, can lead to some pretty cogent and important answers in terms of thinking about the history of our society and how it has been constructed for a particular political, social, economic purpose. Why is this still relevant today? Well, if you ask the question of what's going on, it's always relevant because as Freire would describe it, it's the path to consciousness about injustice, right? It leads us to ask other questions about what we can do together to address what's going on. From a musical standpoint, Marvin Gaye's album was really a break from the formulaic music that came out of Motown, right? There was a Motown magic that was had a very strict formula, and Marvin had to liberate himself from that in order to produce this album. And he was criticized by Berry Gordy, who did not want to release this album, right? And so I think that in and of itself is a testament to musicians and those who are thinking about doing things that are outside the box that may not be, they may not fit a particular formula, that sometimes trusting your own instincts and listening to what's going on in society actually is a better way to go. Marvin did not see this as a protest song. He saw it as a song that was speaking to what was happening at the time, the Vietnam War, issues of poverty and so on, the exploitation of the labor of poor folks, right? The hippie movement, the movement toward free love. But also he was talking about the experiences that he had growing up of being abused by his father in the home. So when he talks about love, only love can conquer hate, he's talking about several things there. But it's also a statement against the Vietnam War. As I conclude, let me think about, is there some message in the song for current social movements? And if you ask that question, you have to say, well, absolutely, right? What's the most important phrase I think we are reciting today as we think about social justice? Black Lives Matter, which exists because we find ourselves in this strange moment, right, where Black lives continue to be stamped out needlessly by police and others, right? We know about what happened to Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia by a couple of neighborhood citizens, right? But white people feel like they have the right, the authority to stamp out Black lives if there's any sort of threat presumed. It also, I think, if we ask what's going on today, we have to talk about the fragility of democracy, right? On January 6th, the insurrectionists reminded us of how many people there are who would favor an authoritarian and white supremacist government over a free, democratic, and diversely led one, right? And so that is a constant reminder of how fragile democracy truly is. I think Marvin Gaye's words call upon us to continue to believe in the ideal of democracy, to believe that we too sing America, in the words of Langston Hughes. It calls us to not only question inequality and injustice, but to build a path toward justice, toward wholeness, and toward joy. He calls us to pursue Black joy, as I was recently reminded by venerable education scholar, Dr. Bettina Love. If you haven't read Bettina Love's work, get it quick, fast, and in a hurry, okay? She is a scholar for the ages. But in the tradition of Marvin Gaye, she invites us to ask, what's going on? But then she says we must go further than that. We must ask, how did we get here? And we must forge a path towards systemic transformation and change on behalf of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US and across the globe. We cannot be satisfied, she says, with incremental change. The time is now. The time is now. What's going on? Freedom. That's what's going on. Thank you very much. And so if I still have time, Dr. Dance, I will indulge in a little bit of singing, and I'll just sing the first part of that
Most
beautiful song.
definitely, most definitely.
Okay, let me get this music queued up here. Reciting those lyrics is that's exciting. It gets you going. All right, let's see what happens when you sing them. Can y'all hear that?
Yes.
Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. You know we got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Yeah. Father, Father, we don't need to escalate. You see, war is not the answer, but only love can conquer hate. You know we got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Picket lines, picket signs, don't punish me with brutality. Come on, talk to me so you can see what's going on. Hey, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Hey, hey. All right. Thank you very much.
Woohoo! I'm clapping with one hand over here. I broke my wrist, so I can't clap with two. Whoa! What a way! Thank you, Dr. Lynn. What a way to take us into some Q&A. What a way to take us into some Q&A. So now I'm opening the floor up to questions, and let's see that Jackson wants to speak, but I'm going to ask people to go ahead and jump in. But Jackson, go ahead.
Yeah, that was actually a little bit of an accident, but I will point out to you that a question did materialize in the chat right after Anders spoke. This is a question is directed to Anders. The artist in the video was wearing a New York Yankees hat. To what extent does American history influence Swedish interpretations of racism? And to what extent does African American history influence Afro-Swedish interpretations of racism and liberation?
Thank you. I'll try to answer that. It's together with my partner and my colleague, we are trying to write a Swedish version of the Swedish racial formation. And that goes to I mean, Sweden in many ways is strongly influenced by US in a number of ways. And most parts, both what I would say, the more progressive and the more reactionary parts of the US society. But going back to the 60s and 70s, I mean, Vietnam deserters were welcome as refugees to and with Vietnam refugees came a lot of black Americans to Sweden. There was also Black Panther Party visiting Sweden, doing tours in radical circles in Sweden and so on. So that, and I would say Sweden was probably the staunchest supporter in the Northern Hemisphere of the US civil rights movement and South African emancipation against apartheid, and especially the ANC COSATU movement. So But at the same time, racism in Sweden has always been projected as being outside of Sweden. It's been the bad racism in South Africa and the bad racism in United States and other places, but racism has never really happened in Sweden, despite the history that we were competing with Germany and United States already in the 1920s. About we had a racial biology institute in Uppsala in Sweden and so on. So a lot of our discussion around racism is very much shaped by discussion in relation to United States, sometimes mediated by UK discussions as well. And to answer more precisely, yes, the Afro-Swedish interpretation of racism is very much influenced by the civil rights movement in United States, and also very much taken a direct translation of critical race theory to Sweden. And what we are trying to work on scholarly now is how can we use critical race theory but adopt it to a Swedish context, because it's problematic to take it from the straight from United States to Sweden. We have not had the transatlantic slavery, although we were intermediaries as selling the iron the slaves were brought to America with, or the ships that they were transported with. But the colonial transatlantic colonial history of Sweden is a failure, besides the economic benefits of being an intermediary. So how do we translate critical race theory into a Swedish context? And what I was trying to exemplify with the song is that this is some aspects in an artistic way of doing it. And there are a number of scholars in Sweden. We are, some of them, trying to do this work, which is badly needed, especially in a context in Sweden as it is today. Thank you.
Can I also respond to the question around critical race theory in Sweden? Because it reminded me of an experience I had. I've been to South Africa twice to talk about critical race theory, and the same question came up, right? And it was the question of, look, you're talking about slavery, and I showed them a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is an African-American scholar, woman, professor of mine from UCLA and Columbia. And I thought they would find affinity with her, and they did not, right? Because, and so it was a really interesting thought. But one of the things I said, and I would say the same thing here, is that critical race theory has a specific historical context and lineage that comes out of the African-American experience and slavery and civil rights and all that. But it only has that specific historical lineage because of where it is being sort of utilized, right? So if you think about critical race theory within the context of Sweden, it calls upon you to think about the ways in which race and racism have been shaped by and shape and influence the structures of that society, right? And then I think it calls upon you to really situate your analysis within the perspectives and the experiences of racialized, minoritized folks in Sweden, right? In terms of what their experiences have been, and try to really understand what is the historical context out of which those experiences are born. And I would say that the same thing for places like South Africa, although you have the issue around indigeneity in South Africa that I think has to also be dealt with in a different way. But so critical race theory gives you the opportunity to really focus on the experiential component of racially marginalized and oppressed people, and then to try to understand through the analysis of policy and historical documents and texts, laws, and so on, sort of what is at the root of those experiences.
Yes, I want to thank you, Marvin. Thank you. And I saw Dawne shaking her head when you said they thought that they would find some affinity with Kimberly Crenshaw. So I'm going to ask Dr. Curry to speak about her take on that. And Anders, I want to come back to you because in regard to Sweden, I know that Swedish laws speak equality and equity, and Swedish practices show something different. right? And that's a ripe space for critical race theory. But Dr. Curry, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the conversation. One of the things that I learned, from going to South Africa since 1997, is I wasn't expecting not to be accepted by Black people. I thought I was going to the continent, I would be welcome, I would be embraced. But instead, I had my Blackness challenged because here I am, a light-skinned woman. People were asking me, say, well, which one of your parents is white? And I say neither. And I had a hard time understanding. And then, you have to put it in historical context. You go to slavery, and things and miscegenation and all of that. And then one time I was at a party. So no, let me go back. In 1997, I was on a Social Science Research Council pre-dissertation fellowship, and I was learning Zulu, and I was in the rural areas. And I showed a picture of my boyfriend, and he was with other men on the picture and different complexions. And, so they all pointed to the Latino guy. But yet my boyfriend was the dark-skinned man. And they were like, hey, Bo, that's a Zulu man. And so it was all of this hoopla about, is she Black or not? And then finally, one auntie says, the woman says she's Black, let her be Black. And I had to struggle with this for 20 years. I struggled with, how race is a social construction and, being in a different place. And then one time I was at a party with the apartheid regime referred to as coloreds or person of mixed ancestry. So people immediately put me in that category. So I was at a party telling jokes, and they said, she's quite funny with her fake American accent. Now, how can I fake this accent? But, I feel affinity with Black African people because, we have a shared common history. And so when I'm with Africans, colors look at me askance. And then when I'm with, because they see me as one of their own, it's what one of my friends at Western Washington calls the middle minority when he talks about colors and their space, because colors see themselves more like us. In terms of history, they were the buffer between white and Black during apartheid. And, during apartheid, they weren't white enough. And today they're not Black enough. And that's something I had to navigate, negotiate and navigate for the past 20 years. And I'm finally cool with, when I'm with coloreds, my people. When I'm with Africans, my people. But it took a long while because I still don't understand when they have representations who fall under different complexions, why they can't see the same for us.
Tommy, I think it speaks to a larger point about the global significance of African-American theory and as well as music, right? I mean, we're talking here about the intersection of really of Black music and theory. Critical race theory comes out of the Black experience, but also how we are then viewed by people on multiple levels, right? Because of our skin color or because of whatever. But I think I see it as African American culture, and there's so much that comes out of that is really has a global appeal in many ways, and sometimes appeal also means critique, right? And so we get both sides of that coin.
Yeah, and if I continue there, because I think the strength of the US university system means that it's spread both the less good as well as the better part. And in this way, I'm talking about critical race theory as the better part. But it's also disseminated from a situation where the US reality is often taken for granted. And what I'm working with now is how do we talk about racial formation in a Swedish context? How do we talk about it in a European context? Because it's clearly a different process of racialization and a different history. And I think in Europe, or at least in some parts of Europe, in the critical race theory field, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism and the concept of racial capitalism has been reawoken. And I think that is also a way to, because he really started by arguing that capitalism was born as a racial project even in Europe and before the transatlantic slavery. So it's also a way of talking about different genesises of racial formation that needs to be taken into account when we talk about specific racial formations. And that's also why I wanted to show this song, because this song is by Timbuktu, as I said, has African US parents. And I mean, even in the music and a lot of the progressive music, at least speaking against racism, takes its inspiration from different currents of US music, from Black artists and Black singers, Black musicians, and so on.
Thank you. And and I want to switch to, I got a question for you all. I just want to say, being a Black American in Sweden, it's like I can live in a totally different world most of the time from Afro Swedes, I've learned. I mean, I get a totally different treatment, a totally different reception. I mean, and later, nowadays, the fascists don't like anyone with dark hair and dark eyes. But from more mainstream Swedes, I get a very different. And I think therein lies that critical race theory perspective of laws that claim to be about equity that are not, and actual practices that racialize and exclude. But here's a question I have to our panelists, and that is, Dawne started out with emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Each of you talked about critical consciousness. Anders is talking about how Timbuktu and other rap artists are really raising that awareness. And then Marvin, Dr. Lynn, Dr. Neergaard, Dr. Carey, you spoke directly about critical consciousness. And I would like to hear more about the role of music that comes from Black diasporic folk and critical consciousness. Do you have more to say about that? Kind of music coming from the Black diaspora and critical consciousness.
Well, I'll start by saying, I am a performer of what are called, or used to be called, Negro spirituals. I think they're now called African American spirituals. And so that's where it began in many ways for us, right? And those are songs that have a lot of double meaning on its face. And you singing about I'll fly away, right? It sounds like somebody who's talking about and focusing on heaven. But in fact, it's about escaping from slavery, escaping from the degradation of racism, right? And many of the songs that come out of that period had those sort of double meanings and were protest songs that were parading as hallelujah songs or praise and glory songs or whatever, and so that's where I think it starts, and then I think you can look to hip hop all the way up to hip hop, and I think hip hop's initial birth was about speaking to issues of injustice and policing and so on. And I think there are lots of historical examples you can look to within the hip hop music industry. And hip hop eventually got sort of commercialized and turned into something else. But I think its very roots were about protest.
And I like to, expound upon what Marvin has said, particularly in the South African context with the hidden transcripts or the public transcripts of songs during the apartheid era from 1948 to 1994. South Africans just created songs, whatever they felt like composing. A song would just emerge. And one of the songs was about Andre Verwoerd, who was the prime minister of South Africa and often considered the architect of apartheid. And so you have this song called Nasi Indoda Nyama of Verwoerd, which means beware Verwoerd, the black man is coming. But it's an uplifting, upbeat song. People are dancing. You think it's, talking about something very rejoiceful, but actually, I guess if you look at it this way, it could be. But it's actually saying, we will shoot you, we will kill you. Be careful of what you say, what you do. So this was a man who was responsible for the Group Areas Act, which set aside racial enclaves on the outskirts of South African cities. And then, you talk about the diaspora, and you had South African exiles living in the United States, like Miriam Makeba, like Hugh Masekela, and who also were the griots who were creating songs to tell America about what was going on in South Africa, particularly the 1976 Soweto uprising, in which Hugh Masekela wrote a song called Soweto Blues, and Miriam Makeba interpreted with her vocals. And they talk about how the children got a letter from the master today. And what that song was about was a protest because Africans did not want to learn Afrikaans, which was considered the language of the oppressor. And the oppressor in this case were Afrikaners, or they were also the Dutch, the descendants of Dutch. So Harry Belafonte always told Miriam Makeba, one day, keep your nose clean because one day your voice is going to be needed. And there she was at the United Nations talking about apartheid, talking about abolishing it, calling for sanctions. And she is in the diaspora, the same diaspora that once had segregated schools, segregated this. But she was taking the land of the United Nations, which was diplomatic soil in South Africa, and confronting the people in South Africa. And this was especially important given the fact that she left in 1959, her mom died in 1960, and they would not let her return to bury her mother. So the pain, all of that pain of not being able to carry out burial rites, can be traced back further into history. It can be traced back to the slave castles in Elmina, or Cape Coast, those echoes of those who died and who were buried in paupers' graves or unmarked graves. So yeah, the continuity between the geographical space and the music and the consciousness is very real, very palpable, and we have all been in conversation with each other.
In a Swedish context, I would say that there's a lot of implicit consciousness raising through music in, again, I have to reiterate, the suburbs of Sweden around the big cities is what in US are the inner cities in general. Among youth, among a pan-racialized youth in the cities, where the Afro-Swedes are a fairly small group in numbers, but when it comes to music, they are quite present and so on. Partially because a lot of the music is influenced by US, Afro-American different musical traditions and so on. However, there's a radicalization in this consciousness raising through music that then stops at the organizational level. And that partially reflects an older generation sitting in organizations that do not see this music as consciousness raising, but more as using foul language, being angry, and so on. So there's an issue of connection here that stops some of the processes of consciousness raising among the youth in Sweden. And then also I saw the question, and I can relate that partially about gender. We haven't spoken very much about gender, but I mean, the concept of intersectionality has been strongly in both migration, anti-racist research, critical race theory, and I would say in Sweden, this research field is dominated by women, whereas, I mean, and that's also linked to that a lot of the social movements, anti-racist social movements, migration, pro-migration social movements are dominated by women, although they come from a tradition of anti-fascism that was extremely dominated by men. So we are seeing a shift in that sense, and I think it's a shift both within the universities in scholarly work on racism, but also in a bigger platform for women. Sometimes, as we saw partially in US linked to Black Lives Matter, that the women are more visible as leaders of social movements, civil rights, anti-racist social movements.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you, Anders, because that was you segue into the question asked by Maya, who asked if someone could elaborate specifically on the role of gender feminism in the production of anti-fascism, anti-racist music. How does this music simultaneously reconcile structures of patriarchy, class, and racism? So I wanted to know if Marvin or Dawne wanted to speak to that. And I also see someone is asking about the future of the ties between Black liberation and music. But let's go first to the gender question.
Well,
you have to unmute yourself, Marvin.
Oh, sorry, Maya, I'm impressed with the way you constructed that question. So I'd like to hear what Maya has to say. But I'm thinking about several things. I'm thinking about artists like Nina Simone and Queen Latifah. I mean, two very different historical periods, right? Nina Simone is the 50s and 60s, but really speaking to the complexities of what it means to be a Black woman of a certain body type with a certain facial features and so on, right? And what that meant in this music industry and how she was constructed, how she was treated, and speaking to that in her music. I find such power in Nina Simone and her call for justice through the lens, right, of a Black woman who was really struggling with mental health issues and a variety of things that were impacting her life at the time. And then I speak, fast forward 30 years or 40 years. I mentioned Queen Latifah, right, who you calling a bee, right? That phrase was so significant in hip hop because, and it still, unfortunately, is common parlance in hip hop. But I think to sort of raise that question at that critical moment of hip hop's development was so important in forcing us to sort of rethink the terms and the codes, right, that folks were using and embracing and accepting as being sort of the language of hip hop. But also being a strong, vibrant, smart Black woman who was multifaceted and dynamic and could do many, many things. From a scholarly standpoint, I guess I point to folks like Trisha Rose and others who are, I think, pointing to these questions within hip hop in a really dynamic and interesting way.
I mean, you expect me to say something?
If you want to.
Well, you know, if we were to look at the apartheid context and how music was created during that time, it was more like a democracy in terms of gender and also in terms of age, because anybody could sing those songs, and you would see the young, the middle-aged, and the elderly, you know, singing the songs together. So I think, you know, going to the question that's in the chat about will protests create the music or music will create the protests. And from what I saw in South Africa, the protests created the music because the compositions would come with whatever was going on. For instance, if there was a forced removal, families are thrown out on the streets, all their belongings, and removed from, say, Sophia Town, which is in Western Johannesburg, to Meadowlands, which is one of the sprawling townships in Soweto, the southwestern townships, as it is known as the acronym spells. You know, there was a song called Meadowlands, and it talked about the moving and the forced removal. So to me, in regards to the South African context, the gender is intersected more so than defined. And when I say in the South African context, I'm talking about apartheid. I'm not talking about Kwaito, which is their version of hip hop. I'm talking about, you know, when songs were, you know, somebody will hum a tune and then somebody would create words, the organic processing of music.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just add a little bit from the Swedish point? I mean, this poetry slam in the suburbs have increasingly allowed women to take stand, and it's a form, often a form of social justice, anti-racist movement. But I also want to make one comment from a Swedish and probably also European point, and that is that there's, I mean, when we saw intersectional Black feminism grow forth, they did it both because they were partially silenced by Black men, but also white feminism as a problem in itself. And in Europe, this has especially been articulated as anti-Muslim feminism, but we have a big division, not that strong in Sweden, but especially in Germany and France, where a lot of white feminists ally more with movements focusing on blaming everything on the Muslim other than building some kind of intersectional alliance for social justice. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I want to also bring to the attention that Black Lives Matter is up for a Nobel Peace Prize. Were they nominated or did they receive it? I know it's one or the other. So the sisters who created Black Lives Matter and a Nobel Peace Prize. I do think that when we think of like hip hop in particular, you have what Dr. Lynn, what Marvin referred to as hip hop co-opted by the industry, and that's extremely sexist, misogynistic, patriarchal. But you have the hip hop artists, and that's in the US, but you have the hip hop artists who never strayed away from the origins of hip hop in the way that challenges white supremacy, patriarchy. Or you have hip hop artists like Nelly. What was that song? The women of Spelman came after him, right? There was
Was it Tip Drill?
It was Tip Drill, right? So you have women now, at the very least, in addition to those who are rapping themselves, empowered to speak back against the patriarchy, the exploitative lyrics, the misogyny in hip hop. But I want to remind us that hip hop that money gets thrown at by mainstream and by corporations is the hip hop that is anti-Black, that is pushing things that destroy us. And that's a challenge that it's often faced when the mainstream and the corporate entities take over. But I guess I want to ask a question along those lines, and that is, how do we, and I'm talking about we listening to the scholars who have spoken today, this evening, in the early morning for Dr. Neergaard, how do we uplift music as liberation, music as anti-racist, music as anti-sexist? What are your ideas about that? Because you're always going to have the industries pushing patriarchy, misogyny, supremacies. So whether you see our roles as woke individuals in linking music to liberation, to anti-sexism, to anti-racism.
I look at it, the liberation with music is with our spirits and our souls. To me, freeing of the mind and freeing of the body and the soul is one way that we conquer that. So to me, my liberation is listening to jazz, is listening to hip hop, is listening to Marvin Gaye, is listening to all of the Motown sound. And I think that's how we listen, because there are messages encoded in these music and in these songs that need to be deciphered and applied to everyday life.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you said something, Tommy, that made me think about the need for us to really support those artists that are sharing a good message, and sometimes they're hard to find, because the ones who are sharing the very negative, sexist and racist and homophobic messages are the ones that are produced and promoted by their record companies, right? So I think we have to be insistent about finding that music that is uplifting, that is healing, and that has that power. And there's a lot of music in our past that we can refer to, but I think there's a real struggle right now of making sure that new artists can continue to create new music, and they can actually have a career, right? If they are speaking about justice, if they're speaking about racism and these other kinds of things. And so I think we have to promote that. We have to advance that. I was thinking just about sort of what I will do next as a person who has the opportunity to speak in forums like this, and that is to draw much more so on music, and music that has the kind of themes that are relevant to what I'm trying to say. And I have not done that to this point. So I think that's a commitment that I have as a way to illustrate, in fact, how music can be used to help us have a conversation about critical race theory in multiple contexts, right?
Yeah, I would take that also as a challenge and inspiration this last day, because for me, music is mainly located in the two other of my circles. I really live in three circles, partially overlapping. A family, all progressive and so on, an activist life, and then an academic life. And they are partially overlapping, but music is rarely in the academic life, and it's generally in the other two circles of my life. So on the one hand, as Dawne was saying, music talks to me in different moods and give me strength and allows me to cry without becoming depressed. So that's, in a sense, my own exploitation of all this fantastic music. The other part is the collective listening to music. When we hear this, for instance, this song that I was showing up, and when we hear that together, we feel a strength as a collective, as someone that can influence, although probably very little, but still influence the change of the world today. So, but this challenge of showing. I've only used the classic international when I teach labor history to show how it's been translated over time and between countries. But you could do the same in a critical race theory class to show how different artists in different countries visualize the racism that they experience in different places and at different times and so on. So thank you for the question. It's a task for me to do. Thank you.
Well, as we close down, some of us are going to stay behind. For those of you who want to ask a few more questions, I want to thank all three of our distinguished speakers. This is the inaugural Black Musicians in Liberation, so we hope to do this every year around this time. And I know we might go over a minute or two, but I want to give each one of the speakers the opportunity to answer the question, what do you see as the ties between Black liberation, the future of Black liberation and music, the ties between going into the future of Black liberation and music? So if each one of you could take a minute or so to say what comes to mind when you hear that, the future of Black liberation and music. You can repeat something you've already said, because some of you've kind of addressed it a bit, but go ahead and reiterate.
You know, what I am enjoying right now is seeing artists who are not typically what we would consider socially conscious, right? Who are grappling with Black Lives Matter and who are grappling with the very real content and are talking about I think there's a song called 8 minutes and 46 seconds that I recently heard, right? So people are really grappling with our reality in ways that perhaps they may not have in the past. And I see more sort of mainstream artists taking up social commentary in their music. And so perhaps it's not going to be something that just a few people do, Common or whoever, right? But that it is really something that all artists do at different moments, at different historical periods, to speak to specific problems that we are having and experiencing in our society. And it will not be a strange thing. It will not be something that will cause your career to be at risk and those kinds of things, but it'll be just part of what everybody does. And I think as scholars, then we will be better at integrating, I think, music into what we do to show the relationship between liberation and music.
I see liberation and music also intersecting with graffiti, other cultural art forms. And I think it'll be more of a blossoming of expression. Salt and Pepper always said, express yourself, you gotta be you. And I think the historical moments will cause us to investigate and really think about within ourselves whom we really are and whom we want to be as a people. And to me, the liberation is going to come from those who can spit, those who can draw, those who can put a clef and a note together, but as well, analyze as historians, as sociologists, as political scientists, as geographers, because we all need to be involved in this conversation that leads to freedom, because it is a road seldom traveled by the multitude.
Mm-hmm. Anders?
Yeah, I would say I come from a structuralist sociology, starting with Marxism and then theories of patriarchy, and then finally theories around critical race theory generally. And the disadvantage with structural is that it's fairly without body, flesh, and identity. It's fantastic in showing how oppression works and so on. But to challenge society and to build a movement, I think artists, music, graffiti artists, other forms of artists play a central role. I don't think it's possible to have a strong social movement without identity formation, and central in identity formation is music and other artistic expression. So I always think of myself that I don't have a place when we've won, but artists will always have a place in forging an identity around social justice and an identity that makes us capable of fighting tomorrow as well, and some ideas about the future to come. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I also think, excuse me, poetry is going to be even more relevant too. And we need not leave that out as a cultural art form.
Oh yeah, Amanda Gordon taught us that, didn't she? Yes.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Amanda Gorman is just amazing. You know, and I think it's going to continue to tell our story, right, across the globe. I think, you know, like I said, the song 8 minutes and 46 seconds is a popular rap artist who wrote that. And how many people now know exactly what happened to George Floyd as a result of listening to that song?
A lot.
Exactly. Well, thank our guest speakers again. Thank you all. Thank you, Black Cat House, for organizing this, Institute for Ethnic Studies, African and African American Studies, of which actually Dr. Curry is the liaison for. So I like to thank everyone. And we're going to put back up Change by Sam Cooke. And if you want to stick around for a few more minutes, then please do so. After the song Change by Sam Cooke ends, we'll spend maybe 10 more minutes for those who like to continue talking to do so. Anders, I'm hoping you're going to stick around, but I know, what time is it there in Svarta in Sweden?
It's 3:30 in the morning.
Okay. All right. So we hope to see you in about 4 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Jackson, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm good. Thanks, y'all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
So much.
My pleasure.
Colleagues.
Yeah, thank you. This was really a lot of fun. Thank you.